This week, we're going to look at the first big debate in the modern period of philosophy. This debate is between the rationalists and the nativists on one side, and the empiricists on the other. So rationalists hold that not all our knowledge derives from sense perception. Instead, there's some non-sensory source of knowledge. So we saw that Descartes was a rationalist. For him, the simple intuition of the mind is a non-sensory source of knowledge. It's by a simple intuition of the mind that we know I am, and I'm a thinking thing. Now, to be a nativist is to hold that not all our ideas derive from sense perception. Instead, there are innate ideas. And so rationalism is a thesis about knowledge, and nativism is a thesis about ideas. And we saw that Descartes, in addition to being a rationalist, is also a nativist. Descartes thinks that we have innate ideas of what truth is, what a thing is, and of God. Now, empiricism opposes both rationalism and nativism. Empiricism is the thesis that all our knowledge, and indeed all our ideas, derive from sense perception. We'll see this week that Locke is an empiricist. This week we'll look at Locke's attack on nativism, and we'll look at Leibniz's criticism of Locke. Next week, we'll look at Locke's own empiricist account of the origin of all our ideas. In this way, we'll see that Locke has a two-pronged argument for empiricism. On the one hand, Locke wants to argue that there's no such thing as an innate idea. And on the other hand, Locke wants to provide an account of how sense perception is sufficient to furnish us with all the ideas we actually have. So in this way, Locke wants to show that the nativist thesis is both false and unnecessary. Okay, so Locke's attack on nativism proceeds by canvassing various accounts of innate ideas and arguing that these accounts are either false, incoherent, or trivial. Recall that when Descartes introduced the term innate idea, he drew a distinction between innate ideas, which are supposed to derive from my own nature, and adventitious ideas, which derive from things outside of me by way of sense perception. So in a way, what Locke is doing is asking Descartes, what does it mean for an idea to derive from my own nature? The first candidate definition of innate ideas that Locke considers is that innate ideas are ideas that everyone has from birth. Now, Locke's argument is that if innate ideas are supposed to be ideas that everyone has from birth, then it's simply false that there are any innate ideas. For, as Locke claims, there simply are no ideas that everyone has from birth. To take Descartes' paradigmatic examples of innate ideas, it seems that children couldn't give an account of what truth is, or of what a thing is. And it seems that children are likely not to have an idea of God. And it also seems that there are certain adults that lack ideas of truth, or substance, or God. In response to this objection, you might imagine a nativist altering the definition of innate ideas to say that innate ideas are ideas that everyone has from birth, even though they may be unaware of them. But now, Locke thinks that this definition of innate ideas is incoherent. For Locke, to have an idea is simply to be aware of something. Ideas simply are the objects of our awareness. So there couldn't be an idea of which we're unaware. An idea of which we're unaware would simply not be an idea of ours. Now, I think it's important to notice that this objection would land against Descartes. Remember, in Descartes' second proof of God's existence in Meditation 3, Descartes reasons that I can't be the source of my own existence, since I am not aware of generating my own existence, and I am aware of all of my mental operations. So it would seem that it's not open to Descartes to insist that innate ideas are in the mind from birth, though outside of our awareness. Nevertheless, we might be more inclined to accept that there are ideas in our mind of which we're not conscious. We're much more likely to accept that there is an unconscious store of ideas. But now, if we wanted to claim that innate ideas were ideas that we had from birth in our unconscious, we would have to give an account of the difference between deriving one of these innate ideas from our own unconscious and deriving an acquired idea from things outside of us via sense perception. Locke imagines that the way we'd have to go here is defining innate ideas as ideas that everyone has the capacity to have from birth, or to define innate ideas as ideas that everyone can form from birth. Locke's objection to this nativist thesis is that it's trivial. Specifically, it trivializes the distinction between innate and acquired ideas. Locke's thought here is that every idea I do actually form, I must have been born with the ability to form. After all, if I weren't born with the ability to form a given idea, then I could never have formed that idea. So take the idea of red, for example. I do have the idea of red, but I couldn't have had this idea if I weren't born with the ability to form this idea. So it seems that if we define innate ideas as ideas that everyone has the capacity to form from birth, that would make all of our ideas innate ideas. Why is that a problem for the nativist? The problem is that the nativist wants to draw a distinction between innate ideas and acquired ideas. The nativist thinks there are two distinct sources of ideas. Ideas can be derived from outside of me by sense perception or derived from my own nature. But if all that's meant by deriving an idea from my own nature is being born with the capacity to form the idea, then it would seem that the nativist has failed to draw any distinction between two different ways of deriving ideas, or between two classes of ideas, the innate ideas and the acquired ideas. The nativist wants to single out certain ideas, like the ideas of God, truth, and substance, as ideas that are somehow already contained in the mind, prior to and independently of sense perception. But if all the nativist can do in cashing out the metaphor of being contained in the mind is that we're born with the ability to form these ideas, then it would seem the ideas of truth, substance, and God have no special status. We're born with the ability to form the idea of God in just the same way that we're born with the ability to form the idea of red. Now, the next way that Locke imagines that the nativist would alter their definition of innate ideas in order to escape this criticism is to say that innate ideas aren't ideas that everyone has from birth, but rather to say that innate ideas are ideas that everyone has from the use of reason. The thought here is that innate ideas are intrinsic not to the human mind, but rather to the rational mind. There may be some humans, children in particular, that lack the ideas of truth, substance, and God, but that's precisely because they're not yet rational, and that everyone who has reason has, intrinsic to their reason, the innate ideas of truth, substance, and God. Now, Locke's response to this definition of innate ideas is again to insist that it's false by looking more closely at the case of children. Locke's claim is that children have rational knowledge before they have the ideas of truth, substance, and God. Moreover, Locke thinks that children engage in means-ends reasoning before they can define truth, substance, or God. Now, you might imagine a nativist, again, attempting to alter the definition of innate ideas in response to this Lockean criticism. The nativist might try to say that innate ideas are ideas that everyone has from the use of reason, even though these ideas might somehow be implicit or below the level of conscious awareness. But here again, Locke is going to raise the incoherency and triviality objections. Locke's going to say, well, it's incoherent to say that we have an idea, but only implicitly or without conscious awareness. And at the very least, it's incumbent on the nativist to spell out what it means to have an idea, if we can have ideas in our unconscious. And if all it comes to have an idea in our unconscious, is to have the ability to form an idea, then the nativist thesis will again be trivial. If the nativist were simply to say that the idea of God is innate insofar as we are able to form this idea upon coming to use reason, then it would seem that the idea of God is no different from the idea of red. So the challenge that Locke poses to the nativist is to provide a definition for innate ideas that is neither false, incoherent, or trivial. A final definition that Locke considers is that innate ideas are ideas that are assented to as soon as they are understood. So the thought here is that if you have the idea of God, you can't wonder whether God is omnipotent. Or for another example, if you have the idea of a triangle, you can't wonder whether triangles have three angles. To have the idea of God is to already know that God is omnipotent, and to have the idea of a triangle is already to know that triangles have three angles. By contrast, to have the idea of red isn't already to know that roses are red. So the nativist's thought here would be that the idea of God, the idea of a triangle, and the idea of substance are ideas that must be assented to as soon as they're understood, while acquired ideas are ideas that one can understand without yet assenting to. Well, what Locke points out is that the examples I've just given are cherry-picked. After all, every idea has a definition, and to have that idea is to know the definition. In other words, there are certain pieces of knowledge that I must have in having any idea. So of course, I can't have the idea of God without knowing that God is omnipotent. I can't have the idea of a triangle without knowing that triangles have three sides. But as Locke points out, I can't have the idea of white without knowing that white is not black. I can't have the idea of sweet without knowing that sweet is not bitter. And there's many more examples besides. I can't have the idea of a robin without knowing that a robin's a bird. So in this way, to claim that innate ideas are ideas that are assented to as soon as they're understood, again trivializes the distinction between innate and acquired ideas. Every idea has some piece of knowledge associated with it that must be assented to as soon as one has the idea. This goes not just for God, but for every other idea besides. Locke draws the conclusion from his critique of nativism at a number of places in the reading. One is on page 11. There he writes, "The steps by which the mind attains several truths. The senses at first let in particular ideas and furnish the yet empty cabinet, and the mind by degrees growing familiar with some of them, they are lodged in the memory, and names got to them. Afterwards, the mind proceeding farther abstracts them, and by degrees learns the use of general names. In this manner, the mind comes to be furnished with ideas and language, the materials about which to exercise its discursive activity. Here, the mind at birth is likened to an empty cabinet, and the senses furnish the cabinet with ideas. On page 33, Locke uses the metaphor of blank paper. Here he writes, "Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas." And Locke asks, when comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fantasy of man has painted on it, with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. In that all our knowledge is founded. And Locke distinguishes two different sources of experience, outer experience and inner experience. He writes, "Our observation employed either about external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our mind, perceived and reflected on by ourselves. So the thought is, I come to know what red looks like through outer experience, which Locke calls sensation, and I come to know what pain feels like by inner experience, which Locke calls reflection." The challenge for Locke's empiricism is to give an account of how, simply from the sources of sensation and reflection, we come to acquire ideas not just of colors and tastes and smells, but also ideas of what things are and ideas of substance. We'll look at Locke's attempt to provide that account next week. But for this week, I want to look at Leibniz's response to Locke. Leibniz attempts to articulate a middle ground between Descartes' nativism and Locke's empiricism. Leibniz's criticism of Locke is that the senses can never justify knowledge of universal or necessary truths. Leibniz writes, "Although the senses are necessary for all our actual knowledge, they are not sufficient to provide it all, since they never give us anything but instances, that is, particular or singular truths. But however many instances confirm a general truth, they do not suffice to establish its universal necessity." And Leibniz goes on to give examples of knowledge of universal and necessary truths by referring to pure mathematics, particularly arithmetic and geometry. So Leibniz's thought here is that we have knowledge of universal truths in geometry, like the internal angles of all triangles sum to 180 degrees. But this knowledge can't come from sense experience, according to Leibniz, because sense experience only teaches us particular truths. So sense experience might show us that the internal angles of this one particular triangle sum to 180 degrees. But Leibniz thinks that from one particular truth, or even from a number of particular truths, we can never be justified in making the universal and necessary claim that all triangles have internal angles summing to 180 degrees. So Leibniz thinks this is a problem for empiricism. If all our knowledge derives from experience, then it would be impossible to know universal and necessary truths. Yet Leibniz thinks we do know universal and necessary truths. So he thinks all our knowledge can't derive from sense experience. But now, as I said, Leibniz doesn't simply want to revert to Descartes' nativism. Leibniz doesn't think that the mind is an already stocked cupboard, while Locke likens the mind to an empty cupboard or to a blank sheet of paper. Leibniz likens the mind to a veined block of marble. Leibniz writes, "If there were veins in a block of marble, which marked out the shape of Hercules rather than other shapes, then that block would be more determined to that shape, and Hercules would be innate in it, in a way, even though labor would be required to expose the veins and to polish them into clarity." He goes on, "This is how ideas and truths are innate in us, as inclinations, dispositions, tendencies, or natural potentialities, though not as actualities." Now, I think this is a really intriguing metaphor, and it certainly gives us a third image beside the already stocked cupboard and the empty cupboard of Descartes and Locke. The challenge is to cash out the metaphor. Leibniz grants that experience is necessary for us to come to have any ideas. Experience is like the chisel that carves the block of marble. But Leibniz's thought is that not all of the work of sculpting is done by the chisel. Some of the work is predetermined by the block of marble itself. Because of the veins in a particular block of marble, some statues can be chiseled out of it, and other statues cannot. But now, what in the mind corresponds to these veins in the metaphor? What in the mind determines that certain ideas will be formed on the occasion of sense experience, while other ideas won't be formed on the occasion of sense experience? In the passage I just read, Leibniz refers to inclinations, dispositions, tendencies, and natural potencies. Later on, Leibniz says that the mind is not a bare faculty, consisting in a mere possibility of understanding. He says it's rather a disposition, an aptitude, a preformation. So what I want you to think about is, what's the contrast here? What's the difference between a bare faculty and a disposition. This distinction is essential to Leibniz's account of the mind and the ideas innate in the mind. So what I want you to do in your paper is to reconstruct Locke's argument against nativism, Leibniz's critique of Locke, and Leibniz's own alternative to Locke. I want you to go into more detail about how Leibniz could best flesh out his alternative. I want you to think about how Locke would likely criticize Leibniz. And I want you to think about whether Leibniz's alternative can withstand Locke's best criticism, or whether you think Locke's empiricism makes more sense than Leibniz's alternative.